Hello, world. This is Jenna. Welcome to episode 5 of the Clear the Air podcast. I'm sorry, it's been a while. We know this happens to me. Times go by where it just gets really hectic. But given the current situation, for reference, it's March 20th when I'm filming it. So, given the current situation where everything's closed, school is closed, there's nothing to do right now, I can't really leave my building to go anywhere. What better time to get back on the podcast than now, because I don't have any excuses. So I'm sorry. For an update, the last time I posted was January, so that's a big yikes. But since then, I went to the Leading Change conference in Vancouver. So that was a conference that brought together youth sustainability leaders from across the country to collaborate on solutions, to network, to be inspired and learn and bring their knowledge back to their communities. So that was an amazing experience because I was traveling, couldn't do much podcasting or blogging, and then had some personal things come up in life shortly after that with school and midterm season and everything. It got super hectic. And then when that finally died down, Corona. So now we're here. And the situation right now fits well with the topic that we are going to be discussing in this podcast in terms of feelings around coronavirus and how people are handling it. So I don't want to talk about it much just because one thing I've had to do is to step back from so much media consumption because I found that has been overwhelming for me. It's overwhelming for my friends, and I just need to unplug from that. Of course, listening to the important updates from the government, from official sources, decisions that impact my activities, but I'm trying not to read any conspiracy theories, anything like that. So, that being said, we won't talk about it that much. I will just use it to discuss, I guess, some examples to just explain why the content I'm talking about is relevant. Little disclaimer as well. So I'm in a new apartment. It's not new anymore. I've been here for 3 months, but I haven't filmed here. So the sound is a bit different. It's a bit tinny because it's a larger room. So sorry for the inconsistency with that. And there's also a garbage truck going by, and it's really annoying. So if you hear that, I'm sorry. I don't think you will, but just in case there's a beeping, it's either that or this weird beeping that happens in this apartment because student housing. We are going to be talking about eco-anxiety. This might be a term you've heard before. It might not be. It's a fairly recent term. I've only heard it since starting my undergraduate degree. I think we talked about it in first year a little bit. Maybe not in the first term, but definitely in my second term. So that would have had to have been winter 2018 that I first heard about this term. And it's really been building recently with all of the climate change, action, youth activism, things like that going on. So if you're not familiar with the term, the American Psychological Association coined it as a chronic fear of environmental doom. And they defined this back in 2017. So that shows this isn't really something that's been talked about for long, or it has been talked about, but people didn't really know what to define it as. And it's not a standard term. It's not something that everyone knows. It's not talked about that much. It's definitely something that a lot of us are dealing with, but you can't really talk about it to a therapist, or you can't get treated for it. There's no quote unquote cure for eco-anxiety. So the way I see it, we are hearing about all these things related to climate change that will be impacting our future or impacting us now. So extreme weather, droughts, erosion impacting our food supply, the emissions in the atmosphere making it unsafe to breathe the air outside, or sea level rise is causing entire small island to disappear. These are stressful things to think about. These are not things you would hope for in your future when you start planning out your future. Instead of saying, I want this kind of job, I want I want to live in this city, I want this kind of house, I want this family. People are now thinking about what the climate will be like. They're thinking about, will I even be able to have those opportunities? So this is a term. Eco-anxiety is something I've found that a lot of millennials are experiencing or expressing. There's definitely others who are expressing it as well, but this is the general population that seems the most concerned about it because it's their future that is being the most impacted by it right now. So millennials are typically those that were born between 1980 and 2000. So I fall into that category. People who are older than me fall into that category, and a few people who are younger than me fall into that category. So right now, those are people that are in their 20s/30s who are feeling a little hopeless for their future. I know I've had arguments with family, with friends about whether or not we even want to have children in the future because we don't know what there's going to be, what the world's going to be like. If people had known that this coronavirus outbreak was going to happen 20 years ago, let's say, do you think that people would be wanting to have kids now, knowing that their kids can't even go outside to play? They can't go to school. They can't have play dates. So people are just worried about that. I'm also worried, and I know others are worried about being able to afford a house because things are just so disproportionately allocated in the community. Urban sprawl is a thing, and only the wealthiest get to experience green space. And because things are becoming more and more expensive in our society, it seems impossible to even think about affording a house. Looking at some of the dingy houses that are on the market now and seeing that some of them are going for $1 million because they're in a city like Toronto. But when you've grown up in Toronto and you plan on staying in Toronto, but you can no longer afford it, where are you going to go? So it's things like that that really stress you out, because on top of finding a job, finishing your education, trying to balance a social life, you now have to think about, what am I going to be doing in 10, 20, 30 years? Will I have the basic necessities to support me, to be content with life? What will it look like? Will I want to have kids in this environment? So it's stressful. It's anxiety building, and that's why it's called eco-anxiety. You are afraid of what the future environmental conditions will bring, specifically because of the impacts that climate change has. And I want to clarify that if you haven't noticed it before on the blog or the podcast, climate change is much more than just global warming. Climate change also accounts for ocean acidification, sea level rise, permafrost melt in the north, food insecurity, violence, because populations are fighting over diminishing resources, like, let's say, rivers that are drying out. If two tribal communities use that river and it's drying out and there's less water, they start fighting over those resources. Or as our population grows, and we need more energy, there was a dam built in, for instance, the Amazon River or around the Amazon River, and that dam reduced the water provisions for the tribal communities in that area. And so there was conflict over those resources because of this infrastructure that was trying to provide for a growing population. So we're seeing all these different impacts of climate change, both direct and indirect, short-term and long-term. And all of these things impact our future and contribute to eco-anxiety. Why are we now talking about eco-anxiety all of a sudden? Why is this such a big deal now? I think it's largely because of the youth activists that have been promoting this issue very recently. So we look at Greta, we look at Isra Hersey, we look at Autumn Peltier, we look at all these other youth activists who are so young, and people their age, like in their early to mid-teens, are typically not seen as quote-unquote well-rounded, knowledgeable, responsible people in society. They're seen as kids. But these activists and so many others within local communities or represented at the global scale are proving that youth know what's going on. Youth are smart, and they're thinking about their future, and they are scared for their future. They are expressing their eco-anxiety through political activism. And because of the massive global movement towards climate action, specifically from youth, I think that's when eco-anxiety really started to become an apparent term. And we're seeing how it's impacting other communities. For instance, up north in Canada, when you look at the Inuit populations that are so dependent on the land for hunting, for gathering, with permafrost melt, glacier melt, they're losing their ability to hunt their traditional foods, and they have to hunt in more treacherous conditions, and their hunts are more unsuccessful, and they need to spend more money on westernized approaches to hunting, like using snowmobiles, buying gasoline, things that they didn't use before, but because of climate change, that's really the only way that they're able to afford food now. Or you look at small coastal lying communities on islands. As sea level rises, even just a little bit of water, their islands are slowly getting smaller and smaller. And these islands tend not to be very economically wealthy, or they don't have the resources to adapt to climate change to mitigate the risk. And they're not even the ones contributing to the problem majority of the time. It's the wealthy nations like Canada, like the UK, like the USA, these nations. So these small coastal communities are physically losing their land, and they don't have anywhere to go because they can't fly out. And who's to say that they would even want to leave their islands, because those islands have become their identity for generations. That's where their family grew up. And if they leave those islands, what happens to their identity? So we're hearing more of these type of stories as well, and that's definitely building this idea of eco-anxiety. And it tends to be the people who are most directly impacted that are expressing eco-anxiety the most. So we're seeing these communities like the Inuit up north, like these coastal communities that are already feeling the pressures of climate change, can say, yes, this is how it's impacting our community immediately. And so they're afraid because it's their direct future that's being impacted. And then you look at the millennials, the people who have to grow up in this world that the science is clear. Climate change is only going to amplify if we don't do something. We have a certain amount of climate change impacts that are still going to continue to happen because the effects of climate change are delayed. So we're not seeing the actions that we take today, we're not seeing the impacts tomorrow. Right now, we're seeing the impacts of actions that were taken 10, 20, 30 years ago. So it's delayed. So we are guaranteed to have a certain amount of global warming, emissions rise, these type of things. So our people like me, people my age, we know that these actions are going to happen, and so we're concerned. But other populations might not be as susceptible to eco-anxiety because it doesn't directly impact their future, such as older populations, unless they're considering their grandchildren. But even then, very wealthy older populations are able to handle climate change, or they don't really see the impacts yet because they are better off. They're in a safe environment at this time. But the fact is, climate change is real. It's intensifying, and it is going to impact everyone at some point. If you don't see the impacts right now, they probably are happening, but you are in a place where you are able to adapt and handle it. So it's not as big of a problem. So with eco-anxiety, for me, it's something I think about a lot. Climate change, well, I go to school to study climate change and how we can preserve our futures. Youth activists, it's what they're preaching every day. So eco-anxiety is kind of this all-encompassing thing that never really leaves our minds for the people who are concerned about it, especially if it is impacting your future and the actions you're taking now to protect your future. So eco-anxiety is pretty scary. It is a very real thing. It's the same kind of feelings you would have with regular anxiety. So finding a way to manage it, especially because it's still not considered I don't want to say disease. It's not a disease. It's not something that's recognized globally or across the board right now. So if you walked into a counseling service and said, I have eco-anxiety, unless the therapist is trained in eco-anxiety or terror management theory or something like that, they're probably not going to know how to help you. And while mitigating eco-anxiety completely is probably not possible, nor should you, because we should still be worried about our future, because that's what inspires us to take action. There are ways to handle it so it's not impacting your ability to enjoy life, to think of things other than eco-anxiety. So I wanted to share 5 ways for managing eco-anxiety. Now that we've talked about what it is, why it's become a popular issue in the past few years, let's talk about ways that you can manage your own eco-anxiety, or you can help your friends or your family manage their eco-anxiety. The first thing I want you to do is ask yourself, why are you afraid? Why are you feeling this eco-anxiety? What is creating that anxiety in that specific moment that you're feeling it? Did you read something in the news? Did a friend talk about something that they saw in the news? Did you talk about a sensitive issue in class? Identify what it is that is stimulating that eco-anxiety, that's causing that. And the more often it happens, recognize what it is that is causing it. Do you have these common triggers? And finding these common triggers is helpful, because then you can start thinking of ways or thinking of strategies to help you come down from that anxiety as you're feeling it. So for instance, for me, I am very passionate about issues related to the indigenous peoples, their history with colonialism, with disenfranchisement, just how they've faced so much injustice in their history. And seeing how those issues are being amplified by climate change really works me up. And if you've been in a conversation with me when I'm talking about these issues, I can get very passionate, probably cried a few times. So when those moments are happening, if there's a trigger, I can recognize that because I know those issues that trigger me, and I can start building almost like a safety net with regular anxiety strategies. So I have regular anxiety. I've dealt with it for years, and I know some strategies to help me get through that. So things like taking deep breaths, trying to recenter myself, trying to talk to myself and say things are okay, things are calm. So this is just a way to deal with the eco-anxiety in that moment. If you start feeling your heart racing, if you start having shortness of breath because you're so worried about what's happening in the future, what's going on, just finding ways to physically manage the symptoms that you are feeling of that eco-anxiety is so important, especially because sometimes these symptoms happen unexpectedly. You might be walking through the grocery store. You might be in the grocery store right now and seeing the shelves empty, because that happened to me yesterday. I was walking through, and although it's not directly related to climate change, it could be something that people think about in the future. There's a lot of people that are worried about food security because of climate change. So if you see the shelves empty, you might start feeling a panic attack coming on. And so you just need to ground yourself. You need to center yourself, maybe close your eyes, take 3 deep breaths, in through your nose, out through your mouth. Just try to relax yourself and calm yourself, and hopefully that will help deal with the symptoms or whatever your coping strategies are. It's important to have those coping strategies to deal with the physical symptoms in that moment. The second thing I want you to do when you start feeling eco-anxiety is to ask yourself, what can you control? I think with climate change, one of the biggest things that's so frustrating about it is that you feel out of control. It seems like this giant global issue and you're just one person, so how can you possibly control anything that's going on? Through my blog and podcast, that's something I show, that you do have control in the situation. You have control of your own actions, your own responses, and individual actions do make a big impact on the global scale, because if everyone starts taking actions, that's the globe taking action. So it all starts with an individual action. But when you were feeling very overwhelmed by these colossal issues that won't be able to change immediately, like global warming will not be able to change this second. It's not possible. It's not. So if you're worried about global warming, and you start feeling some sort of anxiety coming on, ask yourself, what can I control in this moment? I cannot control global warming in this moment. Nothing I do in this very moment will change it this second. In the long term, yes, but nothing right now is going to change that. And so I should not be beating myself up. I should not be worrying about what is happening in this moment. Of course, it is something to care about, but for my own health, I need to recognize that I am not in control of what is happening at this very moment, but I can control the future. I can control my own actions. I think that anxiety a lot of times happens when people feel out of control. That's something that triggered my anxiety a lot years ago, when I would feel out of control of a situation, because I always felt the need to be in control of everything. So recognizing that you will not be able to control everything, but there are still things that you are able to control, that is a comfort in some way, while also recognizing the reality that we live in. The third thing, and I touched on this a bit earlier related to coronavirus, is that you need to disconnect sometimes. If you are getting overwhelmed by the media, by news stories about devastation, about flooding, about all these impacts that are happening, it might be best for you to take a step back and just pause. Maybe it's like a social media cleanse that people call it, where you need to step away from the social media for a while. You need to unplug. You need to not listen to the news, maybe for a day, maybe a week, whatever it may be. And you just need to allow yourself to live your life. So right now, the first few days of this coronavirus crisis in Canada, specifically in Ontario, so it's only been a big issue here for a week. Last Friday, my school was canceled and the world just blew up. I think it was Friday the 13th. Everything seemed to change here and it was insane. And then for the next few days, I was just constantly watching the news, constantly on social media, looking at all these things, and it was so anxiety provoking. And I know my friends felt the same way, because we were talking about it with one another, and we were just feeding each other's anxiety. And so the past few days, I realized this, and I said, no, I need to step back. I need to disconnect. I'm still, like I said, connected to the main media sources. I'm making sure that I'm taking the actions that will protect my health. I'm making sure I know what is legally required for me to do, but I'm allowing myself to live my life. I'm allowing myself to go for walks, to get with nature. I am working on my assignments. If people are sending me these conspiracy theories, or if I'm getting all these articles from random sources, I'm not reading them. I don't even look at the headlines. I need that for myself, and I felt a lot calmer in the situation because I'm not feeding that anxiety that is building around the world, because it's not so much about the virus itself at this point, it's the hype around it, and I don't want to feed that hype. I want this to be resolved, and I want people to realize that if we just were smart consumers, and if we stopped feeding each other's anxiety, everyone's craze, then we have a much clearer, much more straightforward view of this issue. And that relates to climate change too. In connection to the last point, the fourth point is that you need to seek clarity. If you are reading an article online about some crazy statistic about how much food we're going to have in the future, or how we won't be able to feed so many people, ask yourself, what are their credentials? What is this source? Where is this information coming from? Do others agree with this source? You need to make sure you are being a smart consumer. I say that all the time to people, especially with the crisis going on right now. Where are you getting your news from? Is it a family member? Is it a scientist from a journal that only publishes devastating news? Like, where are you getting this information from? You need to see the biases that exist with that source, with that perspective, and maybe you need to compare it to other perspectives. So in relation to the food security issue, there's been articles saying that we don't have enough food to feed 50 billion people, or whatever it is, like some crazy number. But the reality is, when you do the more research, we have enough food and we have the food systems in place to provide enough food for the growing population. The real challenge is distribution. How do we distribute this food equally to people? Because there's people who have way too much food right now that it's being wasted. Like 60% of the food in Canada is being consumed and then 40% is being wasted. Meanwhile, there's populations that don't have access to food, where their grocery stores are empty as much as they are here right now, or a pound of grapes costs $30. Like these crazy issues. So it's not a problem with the amount of food that we are creating, it's a problem with the distribution. But if you're just reading these news articles that are spreading rumors about how we're going to run out of food, you need to check your facts, you need to check your source, and you need to make sure you're being a smart consumer. And that has helped me as well, because then I say, no, this does not seem realistic. And when you have that clarity, it's calming in a way, because you can say, this is the truth. I'm not building this craze. I am being a smart consumer. That's just, I have to keep pressing that. Be a smart consumer. The last point I wanted to touch on is talking. We need to talk about these issues. And that's really important when dealing with, sorry, that's the garbage truck if you heard that. We need to talk about eco-anxiety. We need to talk about climate change. I know I said that we need to disconnect sometimes, which is definitely true. But with any type of mental health issue, with any type of internal processing where we're deep in our own thoughts, sometimes the best thing that we can do for ourselves is to talk to others. I know that when I talk to other people about issues that make me uncomfortable, I kind of get a little nervous, a little sweaty, a little on edge. But then by talking to other people, I might realize certain things that I wouldn't have realized by just internally processing it. And maybe I'll hear different perspectives about an issue or things that I didn't realize on my own. And so that is crucial, just to feel connected to other people about these issues and maybe realize that others are going through the same thing and you can be supports for one another, because connection to other people and support for one another it's what keeps us alive. It's what keeps us comforted and feeling not alone, not isolated in the world. So by talking to people, we are maintaining those connections. We're finding these new perspectives, maybe shifting our worldviews, shifting our ideas of climate change, of eco-anxiety, and it's bringing the issue to the table. It's making us feel more comfortable to talk about these issues, because the more that people talk about it, the more real it seems to everyone. So I would strongly encourage you to talk about it if you feel comfortable with family. If your family are very adamant about not talking about it, it's not something that they support in any way and it creates tension within your house, then approach friends or approach maybe a professor that you are connected to, or you should talk to someone, or even write it down in a journal, or write a story. I like writing stories to reflect and try to surface new feelings or new ideas that I didn't consider without putting it on someone, like putting on another perspective. So if I'm feeling a certain way but I can't pinpoint it, maybe I'll write a short story as a different character and try to express my feelings through that character. And sometimes by separating it from myself, I'm able to uncover those feelings. So just having a way of expressing your feelings is so important, because it allows you to identify what those feelings are, and it does relieve this tension, this weight off your shoulders in some sense. So make sure you are talking about it, or you are expressing your feelings in some way. So that is all of my tips, my 5 tips for managing eco-anxiety. To summarize, I want you to ask yourself, when you are feeling anxious about climate change or just any general eco-anxiety, 1, why are you afraid? What can you control? Sometimes, oh my gosh, you were so rude, garbage truck. I'm sorry. Ask yourself, why are you afraid? What can you control? If you are feeling overwhelmed, you need to disconnect, but don't disassociate from the issue. Just take a break. Seek clarity in the information you are getting and talk about it. Find a way to express how you're feeling. Eco-anxiety is not going anywhere. it's probably only going to grow. There's going to be more people that recognize it. Now that we have an official definition out there, people will become more aware of it, and the more we talk about it, the more aware people will be. As with any type of anxiety, it's so essential to be able to manage it, because finding a way to manage our stress, managing our anxiety, allows us to communicate better about the feelings that we are feeling. And so if we can manage our anxiety around climate change, we will be better equipped to actually address climate change. This is a really long podcast. So if you stuck all the way through, thank you. The garbage truck is going by, so I'm really sorry if it's loud. So it's good timing. Thank you so much for listening. I hope this podcast has helped you think about your feelings. Think about what you're thinking. If you didn't know what anxiety or eco-anxiety was, and maybe it was something you've been feeling, but you haven't really known what to call it or how to pinpoint it, maybe now you know. Maybe you should talk about eco-anxiety to others you know and see what their thoughts are on it. I just encourage you to talk about climate change and talk about your feelings with others, because that's the only way that we can make this issue normalized. And we need to normalize it because it's not something that we can deny anymore. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. I don't know if I said that already. Thank you for tuning in. I hope you all have a great day. I hope you stay safe and just stay well and try to find the calm right now. Use these tips to help you manage stress and anxiety in the current situation, because I've been doing that and it's been helping me a lot. Thank you so much, and until next time.